I know that the budget process can be a daunting and stressful procedure. There's so many numbers floating around with many or various factors to consider. You may struggle with creating a budget or making sense of the financial information. Maybe you need the right accountant with the knowledge of independent schools to handle the budgeting, or assist your business manager by taking tasks off of his or her workload. And so, have you ever felt like that where you're stressed, struggling, and trying to make it through which feels like a never-ending budget cycle? Of course, the budget is key in so many ways, and we're going to dive into that as we move forward. And so, as we talked about during the budget process, this is the time of year where I know many independent schools are preparing for the next fiscal year by creating a budget. If you have not heard already, to help support you during this budget season, I have launched a 60-day accounting blitz where you will receive the accounting support to help you through any accounting, bookkeeping process that you may need. And so the budgeting may be something that your school certainly needs at this time. Hi, my name is Watkins, and I'm a virtual CFO and accountant. I work with independent schools like yours to manage the accounting and financial operations so you thrive, prosper, and fully carry out your mission. As an accountant for 21 years, one of the biggest mistakes I have seen is when an organization does not have a budget or is not following the budget. Big mistake. I would say preparing the budget is probably one of my favorite accounting tasks because I get to listen to the dreams, desires, plans, and goals of a company. Then I'm able to help that school or company to work towards their initiatives by walking them through accounting tasks, especially the budget. Questions, please feel free to put them in the comments below and I will be sure to answer them. So today I want to talk about creating a budget for your independent school. I have lots of great information to share with you. A budget, it brings financial organization, saving countless time, headaches, and even to your bottom line dollar budget. Without a budget, there is no plan in place, and oftentimes an organization is operating blindly or ineffectively. The budget helps with managing the finances properly and prioritizes what is important, such as your key drivers, your financial goals, and certainly your mission. Budgets can help to show various scenarios of good, better, and worst case scenarios. We talked briefly or touched on last week about how budget helps to make sound financial decisions. It helps you to gain insights about your school, to formulate strategies and map out a plan. And then a budget helps to stay on track with the finances. And then certainly you will come across when dealing with grantors or donors and banks that they will require a detailed budget that outlines your income and expenses. And so a question that's often asked is how to develop a budget. And so I'm going to walk you through that just as an overview, not into grave details, so that it's easy to follow along and there's not a lot of numbers flying around. So when developing the budget, some of the key things you want to do is to budget for every line item. I have seen instances where it's been just budgeted on just subtotals. Not every line item or expense or even revenues were accounted for. And so when you do that, it causes the budget to not have a complete full projection or view of what your operating will be for the fiscal year. The second thing when creating the budget is to create a realistic budget and not to be overly optimistic. You want to be as precise as possible so that you have a realistic viewpoint of what your school's finances will look like. Then thirdly, when developing a budget, you want to start with a set of assumptions, including the economic outlook. Right now, we're still in the midst of a pandemic, and so you want to consider what impact or that has on your independent school and budget accordingly for that. Then also the industry outlook that's specific to private schools. I read recently how during the pandemic, a positive note is that many families sought to enroll their child into a private school. And so that caused a positive impact on enrollment. You also want to look at the assumption of enrollment, tuition costs, financial aid, any increases in spending, as well as if there's any new or major initiatives that are going to happen at your school. So you want to have all of these assumptions included in when you're developing your budget. Then when you're developing your budget, you want to be sure to look at your revenues, to calculate your revenues. And so now we're going to focus into the financial statement, statement of activity, which is your revenues and expenses. The revenues are important because they ensure that your independent school has income to operate. You want to be conservative with revenue and not overstate your revenues. So when you enter your revenue or your budget for your revenues, you want to be as precise as possible. And one key benchmark or guide is by looking at past revenues that will help you to create the budget to be as precise as possible when creating the budget by looking at past historical revenues. Now, of course, since we have been in a pandemic, it may be somewhat of a difference, but generally speaking, typically you can look at your historical data. You want to also look at revenue trends, how much revenue in total was generated last year, how much revenue was generated each month. What are those months where revenues rise or dip? And certainly with private schools, we know that the summer months are probably the times where you will see the revenue dip. To stay relatively steady. And so that's where your other sources, which you also want to know, what are your sources of revenue, fundraisers, annual fund, programs, camps, how all of those supplemental revenues can help to support your school's mission. And then the last part when developing a budget is to calculate the expenses. which we know that expenses are the cost to operate. The budget can show how much cash or revenue you will need to fully cover expenses. You want to determine how much you will spend each month for your fixed costs, which are the expenses that stay the same from month to month. Then there's variable costs, and these are the expenses that will change from month to month. Over time, you'll definitely get a sense of how these expenses, variable expenses that is, will fluctuate during certain months, and then you can budget accordingly to that. But if the variable expenses tend to just go in a sporadic, if it's sporadic, then you can take the average of a few months to try to get a better estimate. And then third, you have your non-recurring expenses. So typically, fixed and variable costs will be regular expenses that you pay each month. But with non-recurring, these happen infrequently. They may not happen every month. They may be one-time expenses or just a few times throughout the year. And so you want to consider those when you're calculating your expenses, your fixed costs, your variable costs, and your non-recurring costs. And so you're going to pull all of that together in your budget. You have your assumptions, your revenues, your expenses, and now you're ready to tally all of this up and to see what you're projecting your budget to be for the fiscal year. Either as a net profit, well, in this case, a net gain or a net deficit. So if you realize that you're spending, if your budget will end with a deficit, you realize that you're spending more than you earned or brought in, you might want to cut spending or focus on opportunities that can boost the revenue. Alternatively, if your revenues are significantly higher than your expenses, which we want, that results in a surplus, then you want to consider investing that surplus maybe to your endowment or saving it towards a contingency fund. Maybe apply it to technology upgrades, new desks and chairs, or for a major repair. So one other factor when developing the budget is, well, you have your budget developed. Now that you have your budget developed, you can utilize this budget to measure and track your results. And you can do that by comparing actual results to the budget. This allows you to measure your year-to-date performance. You know, how did your school perform for the month, year-to-date, or quarter? Did it meet the target goals? You can judge. The second thing you can do is to judge or assess whether your actual is tracking ahead or behind plan. And then the third thing is to analyze the variances. What are causing the variances? Could it be a demand or an increase in revenues? Or for expenses, if there has been overspending to your costs. And then so when you get this information, you want to examine it, take a look at it, and adjust your tactics accordingly so that you can either meet budget or exceed budget by gaining a surplus. You know, budgeting is a critical planning process, but you can have a sigh of relief that you will never stick to the budget, and that's okay, because the point of a budget is to set expectations so you can measure your school's performance, as well as to manage the finances properly so that you map out a plan for your independent school. And so I want to mention again, for a limited time, that I have launched the 60-day accounting Blitz to provide the support your school needs for managing the accounting and financial operations, or even to assist the finance team with tasks. I have opened 10 slots over the next few months for this service. So I want to get you started today by signing up at theoptimalcfo.com.